Okay, well, welcome everybody, most of you once again to what is probably going to be the last of this year's or this semester's events, lectures, co-hosted by the Fundació Recunha and the History and Heritage Program of the University of St. Joseph in Macau. And tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Marco Caboara, whom I met last year when I was doing research over at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and he very kindly allowed me basically to beaver away in their archives while they were getting together some wonderful exhibits of maps, and I was able to catch a little bit of those exhibits as well. And so we had talked about meeting up again when I come over to Hong Kong, but decided it was easier to bring him over to Macau. I think this is the third such trip that you've made by now, to talk about the maps of China, on which he is one of the world's great experts. Marco Caboara currently teaches the history of cartography and the history of science at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He was the curator until very recently of their collection of antique and very beautiful maps. He did not, however, grow up in Hong Kong. He grew up in Genoa, in Italy. He has studied at Pisa, Peking University, and the City University of Hong Kong, a mixture of history, linguistics, and Chinese. And he received his PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle. You seem to be very good in finding very pleasant places in which to study. And one of his great claims to fame is not just that he is an expert on Chinese maps, but that he has recently published this large and extremely beautiful, I would say also extremely heavy, book of maps of China, Regnum Chinae, the printed Western maps of China to 1735. He is now moving forward, I think, with another volume that will follow up this subject with the maps of China after 1735, and also a project on Chinese maps of China. Tonight he's going to be talking to us about mapping China and mapping the world, showing us just, I think, a small selection of the very beautiful maps featured in this volume. So it is a great privilege to hear tonight from one of the world's real experts on maps of China. And I look forward to a fascinating as well as an informative talk. Over to you, Marco.
Many thanks. Well, if it is possible, then I will move in front of the screen.
If you're more comfortable with that.
Yeah, then I will be able to see myself more clearly, the maps I will be describing, and also seeing you better while I talk. if you came here reading about the abstract, basically I will be talking about two topics. European maps of China, that's the subject of that thick book you saw, and also the Ricci map. It's a map published in Beijing in 1602 by Matteo Ricci. It's the first map of the world published in Chinese by a European, giving a modern image of the world to Chinese during the Ming Dynasty. Now, that means I will be talking about basically two maps in detail. The first printed European map of China, printed in 1584 by a Flemish publisher named Ortelius, and this map that is actually in Chinese. This is a Japanese copy in color by Matteo Ricci, made in 1602. Now, to talk about these maps, many other maps will be mentioned, but I will focus on these two, which also match the title, because really China and the world, how China and the world basically fused into maps produced at the end of 1600. And so the structure of my talk will be to give you an idea and also some kind of images and show what maps of China, maps of the world actually entail, both in the Chinese tradition and the European tradition. Then I will connect the European mapping of China and the world to the age of European explorations, basically Columbus and Vasco da Gama, the end of 1400, early 1500, up to the Ortelius Barbuda map, the first map I show you, the Chinese map of 1584. Then I will show you the Ricci map, and I will give you some conclusions. But before, the thing that really is fascinating about maps is that they give you visually an image of how concepts about cultures and places played out in the past. And when we talk about China in European maps, it's not always the same China. I mean, this is the first map. Again, I will be focusing on this. But just shortly after this, already a different image with different details, more details about China was produced in just a few more years. Then this map was the map that any European in 1600 used to understand China. It was printed in the Blaeu Atlas, which was the main resource for people that wanted to know more about the world. And this, in the end, a map that really connects China to Manchuria, Xinjiang, Tibet, Eurasia, up to the Caspian Sea. This is the map. In fact, this is really the breadth of my own book. I cover from 1584 to 1735, each one of them and the one in between. On the other hand, the book talks about European maps of China, the book I just showed you, but these are the Chinese maps of China, and they are not the same China also represented in all these maps. There are basically two styles of creating maps in China. And these maps are the source of the European maps of China that you will see. These maps were the ones that the Jesuits, some of them in Macau, used to create maps of China that then got drawn and printed in Europe. So this is a map from the Song Dynasty with a grid on a stele. This is just like the negative image of the stele, very precise, very clear outlines. But what basically connects all these maps is that they are maps of China within the administrative borders of the different dynasties, Song and Ming Dynasty China. They just represent the country of China that was not conceptualized as a country of China. It was the Song Empire, the Ming Empire, within its borders. There is another way of doing maps that are called in Chinese Yitong, or unification. That's kind of a more broad image in which not only China is included, but neighboring countries is included. Well, China and the world, when you talk about world map, this is in fact a map that when it was created in 1400, it was the map that represented most of the world in any other given tradition. This is Africa. This is Europe. I will talk a bit more about it. The issue is this a map of China or a map of the world? Really, in the Chinese cartography tradition, some maps focus on China, some others have China at the center, but actually gives you the world. In the European tradition, there are basically, until the age of exploration, two modes of maps. Maps produced according to the model of Ptolemy, a Greek cartographer living around 200 CE in Alexandria, but whose maps do not reach us. This is a manuscript copy of around 1400. And these maps have a projection and have a scale. At the same time, their world is simply the inhabitable world, what the Greeks call the ecumene, the part that was known to the Greco-Roman world and the part that was possible to put on a map. Nothing else was shown. This is roughly 1/3 of the known world. Maps in the Middle Ages had another model as well, 3 parts: Asia, Africa, and Europe. No attention to scale whatsoever, a bit more like the Chinese maps we saw. On the other hand, the model of Ptolemy is the model that became used by European map makers when they decided basically to travel around the world, and they had the means to print the maps that they were creating. The original model, that it's a model that goes back to Ptolemy, maps a small part of the world, but it maps it in a way that relates it to the spherical nature of the world. The approach to mapping that was used in the Greco-Roman world by Ptolemy is what was later called cosmography. Basically, it's a mixing of astronomic observation and geographical information. And this is basically the model that projects a spherical surface on a flat sphere by means of mathematical rules. That was the model that we are still using. On the other hand, when in Europe they were creating maps of the world, when the exploration was starting, this is 1 year after Columbus sailed to America. And this is a large book of prints named the Nuremberg Chronicle of the World. But the image of this printed and hand-colored map, the image is an image that goes back to Ptolemy. Europe, Africa, Asia, and also biblical information, Japhet, Sem, and Cam, related to the 3 parts of the world. So when Europeans were starting to map the world, this was still the world that, an image of the world that was used quite currently, also with the strange creatures at the margins. On the other hand, the world maps that were created just at the same time were maps related to the spherical global image of the world. Really, global goes back to these globes, these spherical representations. The first of which that remains with us is being created in 1492, and this is the image that basically guided Columbus to sail from Spain into what he thought was Cipango, Japan. Now, this is the same image, Spain and Japan, that you see reproduced here. It's a globe that lacks half of the content of the globe as we know it, but it's a globe nevertheless, and the scales are, as far as they understood, correct, even though it's exactly the fact that the scale and the size of the world was too small compared to what we know that allowed Columbus to present his project to sail from Spain to Japan as doable. We know with the Pacific and America in the middle, it's not actually possible with the technology of the time to travel. So this is the world that got expanded with the great exploration. But at the time, still without a clear understanding of what was the connection between America and Asia. Navigators were able to cross the Atlantic and get to America. They were able to go around Africa and get to Malaysia, but they were not yet able to go around the world and connect what was the distance of the Pacific Ocean and the relationship between Asia and America. This is a map that basically reflects that time. Africa, quite clear, Red Sea, India, Malaysia, a coast that represents this region, most China, but without any detail, and then without details, the Caribbeans and America. The very significant element in this period of cartography is that, just as you saw in the previous image here, this line, this was the Tordesillas line. It was the line that basically separated the areas pertaining to the Portuguese Empire to the area pertaining to the Spanish Empire. And to the right, to the east, it was under the Portuguese, and here it was under the Spaniards, and it was supposed to meet also 180 degrees on the other side of the globe, around here. And when you create it under two globes, then you see it visually. This is the area that pertains to Portugal. This is the area that pertains to Spain. And the lines, how they connect America and Asia, left uncertain. Nobody knew. That is the part in which Europeans in the age of exploration basically had an understanding of the world. What about the understanding of China? These are the first maps that basically give some information about China in Europe. This is actually a city map. The city map that most likely was derived from Chinese sources, where this is what we know to be now the Pearl River Delta, and this is the city that is called City of China, a square city with a wall that most likely is Canton. This is when the Portuguese arrived. They were in Canton in 1513. They were able to put their hands on a map that then they copied and circulated as part of an atlas that gave this kind of very diagrammatical information about China. But soon, within 30 years, the image of Southeast Asia and South China became much clearer. And these are nautical charts. Basically, they're the rhumb lines, the way to orient basically sea lines. It's a manuscript, and it gives already a readable and usable way to understand the route to China. Soon, basically another snapshot in 20 years, soon you get an image which is just half of a world map, where you finally have a relatively understandable China, Sina region, the region of China. And you also have the Sea of China. Sina is the old name from Latin, and Cinorum China, it goes back actually to the Arabic name for China that is used now, China. So they know of this area, they know of this sea, they know that there are multiple islands in the area of Japan, and they know there is something like a Korea here. All very vague, while the part of Southeast Asia is actually pretty clear. 1570, just 15 years before the printed map on which we will spend some more time, the understanding of China and Japan has progressed further. This is really like a rapid overview, so I'm not stopping on any other map than the two I promised, but here you see Canton, Liangpo is Ningbo. Japan presented as it's accessible to the Portuguese from the south. They call it like the crab-shaped Japan. This is a way to date maps by the shape they give to islands. you can identify that this is a map that reflects the knowledge of Japan of 1560, 70. And the coast of China that is understood until Ningpo is fairly clear. Here, and this Korea is very, very basic. And this brings us to the topic I have been exploring in the past few years in great details, the first printed map of China, a map that was printed in 1584 originally, then reprinted and reprinted many times. It is an image that, first of all, requires understanding the orientation, where the Orient is. That means the East. The East actually is at the bottom, West on top, North here to the right, and then South. And then we can start to see the Great Wall. And we also see many other features. We see that basically the provinces are understood quite correctly. Shanxi, Henan, Shandong, the X is pronounced as Shi, Zhejiang, Canton. Here, not too readable. I couldn't really use this, the way to zoom in these images, so you have just to follow my point. But here is Macau, named Macau. Here is Japan, Philippines. And what you can also see is that in this map, that is the first map that basically gave a clear idea of China to Europeans. Because when we say the image that Europeans had of China, and we look at the previous map, they were manuscript maps, they were not circulating widely. In fact, the circulation was restricted. The Portuguese state did not want these maps to circulate. But once they get printed, this is mass produced. Many thousands of copies get finally available to the public. Now, it's not that anyone is going to have and be able to read a map that is basically here written in Latin. Here you see the title is Chine Description, Nova Description. Nova Description means just new description, but in the terminology of the time on this map, it means a new map. So it's a new map, Nova Description, of China. This is the genesis of China's new map. Once it was called the region of the Sine, with the old names that the Greek and the Romans gave to this land. And it was made by a certain Ludovico Giorgio. Now, we know, having studied, and this is really the work of the, I've been involved and that is reflected in the book. We know by looking at the map, by looking at the exchanges of letters between the map makers and the person that provided them with the map. We know by looking at who was active in cartography that this Ludovico Giorgio was a Portuguese named Luis Jorge Barbuda. And that's why we often call this map the Ortelius Barbuda map. Ortelius was the first editor of an atlas, but he was very methodical in giving credit to the authors of the map he incorporated in the atlas. Now, at that time, having an atlas of China, an atlas of the world with a map for each country in the world, didn't mean that you would have a uniform image for each country in the world. They would just merge, everything was updated. Each country, you would try to get the best map available, and sometimes the only map available. It was the only map available of China. And you also tried as much as you could to fit it in a framework. I mean, basically, the map of China had to be pasted and fitted in a framework where actually Malacca, Siam, what is now Vietnam, were quite well known. These are quite clear in their cartography. On the other hand, whatever is at the north of China is extremely unclear. The southern coast of China probably integrates what we believe for sure was originally a map in Chinese, that was the source of this map, but integrated with the knowledge that the Portuguese had about this coast for many years, as I show you in the manuscript maps. And this, instead, there was nothing to integrate. This area was not known, so Shandong was not even recognized as a peninsula. Maybe this line here has points to an island or a peninsula. Japan, well, Japan was already known for a long time. The Portuguese were in Japan since 1550, so more than 30 years before the map. But they were not used to go from Japan to China, especially not in the north. So they didn't know how to relate actually Japan to China in a clear way, so that they paced it in a way that is first too close and also too much to the south. Korea, not known at all. This is how you basically read a map of this time, trying to understand how different levels of information are pasted into an overall picture. And sometimes they fit, and sometimes they do not. When I started studying this map, I was quite hopeful that I would find at least some kind of match for this long list of cities, presumably on the Silk Road to the north. Not even one name is recognizable. What was the source for this long list of cities? Maybe a book, maybe a written list. What was the source for the names of the provinces? Many books were already talking about names of the Chinese provinces in 1550 to 1580. But what is the source for most of the smaller city names, not the province name? Unknown. They don't sound like Chinese places. So really these maps mix very different kind of material. At the same time, these maps were very, very influential. So what I did in my book, and what is generally now the approach to look at these printed maps, is not just to put them in a line and say, oh, things just went from not knowing much, knowing better and better and better, and that's just like a growing line. But really look at each one of them, the way they were printed, where they were produced, how they were created, what we can understand by really looking at this object, looking at the paper, looking at who put their contribution in the map, for example, Barbuda and Ortelius, but also other people that engraved the copper plate that created the map, publishers of the book, looking at different features, different parts of the map at different levels of understanding. Now I'm basically giving you here, and I will show you in the future slides, a bit of what to do when you look at a map of this time, how to break it down. Clearly, you first look at the map, what we did together before, what is there, what isn't there, which kind of writing is there, but then who made the map, we went a bit into that. How it fits into the project. The map that we saw was part of an atlas, and then who used it, and how did this map manage to go from China to Europe? Because actually, whenever European explorers would go in the Indian Ocean, they would try to map East Africa, West Africa, India. Basically, they would do, they would just use navigational technique, take a profile of the coast. China was very different. They didn't have free access to the country. Most of the time, the Portuguese were just stuck in Macau. Even going to Canton was very, very complicated. But they had a lot of maps printed in Chinese that were freely available on the market, and they would use them to create the maps of China. On the other hand, if you don't know Chinese, it's very limited what you can do with the Chinese map. Soon the Jesuits, though, knew enough Chinese so they can use it. I will show you something about that. But first of all, the atlas, because it's really the reason why this Ortelius map was so influential. And actually, for example, as Priscilla mentioned, before I started teaching history, my title is History of Cartography. It's basically just history of map making, history of maps. Before I did that, I was a map curator. So we had an Ortelius map of China. You can get an Ortelius map of China. It's not particularly rare. It's not particularly cheap either, but it's not this kind of object that is impossible to achieve. There are thousands of copies. They printed maybe 10,000. And many were kept. So many were kept. And why? Because it was part of a mass-produced atlas. Thousands of copies of this atlas were produced, and the maps often are just ripped out of the atlas and just presented to you, collector, dealer, museum, who want a map of China. The interesting thing about this atlas, it's an atlas of the world, but in this same book, in a book of an edition of, let's say, 1595, these four maps coexist. This is a map of the world in the first edition, 1570. Then there is a map of Asia, they're both in the first edition. Actually, we don't have time to go into the details, but the profile of China, you can already see doesn't match. The profile of China here is a big angle that is not here. And then after 15 years from publishing his first edition, Ortelius finally managed to get a map of China. He was extremely happy, but he didn't revise his map of Asia to incorporate this new information. And 10 years later, he got a map of Japan that was much more accurate than whatever is here, for example, as a map of Japan. But that coexisted in his atlas with all the other images of China and Japan. So this atlas is really put the new contribution, they don't delete the old contribution, they create a lot of contradiction for anyone that wants to study these maps and just put them in a line of constant progress and say, oh, by 1595 they knew this, but by 1595 they were still using also this. When we also have to keep it in mind when we look at maps like the Ricci map, that actually was used by Matteo Ricci by, in good part, using this atlas. He created a map of the world by using all the maps in this atlas and translating them into Chinese. The other thing that I did in my book, and that has not been done before because this is the first time that all the maps of China printed in Europe have been lined up, is to see that this map created in 1584, and the entry numbers are simply the maps covered in my book. They are from 1 to 127, from 1584 to 1735. Now, you can see it's a map that is influential, and so in the few years after 1584, 1601, these maps reproduce it in smaller size. But then this map keep being reproduced for more than a century. These maps keep circulating. Mostly going from maps of a large atlas size used for an elite public into maps that are very, very small and used actually as cheap instruction for public that is not at all sophisticated. But a map like this, created in 1584, circulates for more than 100 years. So this is also important when we want to look at maps and how really the knowledge about different countries circulated. In some times, people really thought that they had a good map of China in their hand, and it was a map that was completely obsolete by that time. Also, when they created that map of China, Ortelius, this Flemish author in Antwerp in 1584, he copied details, or rather he uses sources that were also available to the Jesuit in Rome. This is a globe that was in the Jesuit college in Rome where Matteo Ricci studied in 1570. And many of the names that I told you are very difficult to identify in the map by Ortelius, names of cities like Chiaohu, Hianchao, Panhui, Chipuan, they don't match. They sound a bit Chinese, but they don't match mostly. At the same time, you find the same here. I mean, the two provinces match. Henan is written, it lost the age, but it's here, Henan. But Dopaquin, Toichioi, they all match with the Ortelius map of China. That means what was printed was first available in what was one of the most advanced institutions of learning in Rome in 1570. It was a manuscript globe. By saying manuscript, it's not printed, it's not mass-produced, it's just hand-painted. It was, in 1570, elite information. And then when it was printed in 1584, it was available for everyone. And also, at the same time that this map was created, very shortly after that, other maps were created. But again, this map was so influential because it was printed in an atlas. This other map, well, it was not printed in an atlas. It was printed, but we only know of two copies. One in Hong Kong USD, and the other one is actually in the Jesuit archives in Rome. This was a manuscript map at the Jesuit archives in Rome, so much clearer with the Korea that makes sense compared to this. This was a manuscript map, again, created in Italy. On the other hand, circulation is important. People only knew this map. This map was mass-produced. The others were manuscript, or even printed, but not for circulation. Now, we started around what should I consider my target? Ending at 8, this part? I just can...
That'll be fine.
Okay. Then I will tell you a bit more about basically how these Western maps use Chinese maps, and then I will pass to the Ricci map, the other map I wanted to illustrate. Only in one case about maps created in the period I cover in my book, 1584, 1735, 150 years. Only in one case we can identify the source of a Western map of China. This map has been identified as the source. The title at the top, they must have found someone in London that knew enough Chinese, maybe a Jesuit. At least it's a simplified version of this title. This map was printed in Fujian in 1605. This map used this as a blueprint and was printed 20 years later in London. So many details are the same, and plus with supplementary information, we have no doubt whatsoever that this map was the source for this Western map. But this is a one-off. It's the only single case where we know for sure what was the source. This points to the fact that basically Westerners bought printed maps. Printed maps were quite easy to get in China. They were mass-produced as well. The Jesuits also did, but often the Jesuits used atlases. We know from portraits of the Jesuits that when they show proudly their maps, this is Martino Martini, one of the main Jesuit cartographers of China. This is another one, Prospero Intorceta. He's a Sicilian Jesuit, especially famous for having made the first Latin translation of Confucius and given the name Confucius in Latin, the Confucius name we have, that is Conza. So he displays a map. Now, oil painting is quite precise. Even though this is not super clear, we have been able to identify the map in the portrait with this map. That was, again, a map printed in 1643. So we know that Jesuit came back. In this case, what does it mean? He came back to Europe with this map, and the portraitist made a copy of this. Good enough that at least the title matches to a certain degree. And there are not that many maps with this title in this position, maybe 4. What was used most commonly by the Jesuit was an atlas. So before Ortelius created his own atlas of China, in the Ming Dynasty, before Ortelius created his atlas of the world, in China they created an atlas that is basically a book of maps, mass-produced as well. The structure was not the same as the Western map, meaning there is not a map of the world. In Western atlas, you would have a map of the world, map of the 4 continents, and that map of the main countries. Chinese atlases, we call them atlases using the Western name, but basically they are book of maps, and they would have a map for China, they would have a map for each province, they would have textual information about all the provinces, and that they would have certain important features. There would be something for Japan, there would be the northern frontiers, and there would actually also be the sea routes to the Indian Ocean of the eunuch Zheng He, a travel made in 1400 under the Ming Dynasty. We know that basically this map made in the West, in Rome, by a Jesuit who knew Chinese, Michele Ruggeri, is basically based on this map. The profile is very close. We also still have the copy he used in Rome. Now, before I go to the last map, I want to talk about this Ricci map. The issue is really like, how should we describe this map of the world? Is a European map of the world in Chinese? Is a Chinese world map? Were there other Chinese world maps before? In reality, yes, there were other Chinese world maps before. I already showed you very quickly before. Now this map is gigantic. It was created at the beginning of the Ming Dynasty in 1390. To show you how gigantic it is, this is a facsimile. Now, this facsimile was given to South Africa because one of the features of this map is that it actually represents South Africa. The issue with maps is very often some maps are accessible, some are not. The map I show you is in the first archives in Beijing, is not freely accessible. It's not online. There is no digital reproduction. In fact, it's not even possible to see it unless you have very special permission. But in Korea, in 1402, they made a copy of the map. If you compare them, you will see Korea is not so large here, okay? It is pretty large here. We know this map was created in Korea shortly after the other one, but the basis of the map, the profile of Africa are the same. So I'm just going quickly to show you how you read this map as a map of the world, and this map basically is very close to the map produced in China in 1392. China at the center, so it's a world that is not based on a uniform scale. China clearly occupies most of the world. On the other hand, the information available in the world in terms of place names is hundreds of place names for Africa and Europe. Here is just you saw the map is gigantic, so I just give you a rough outline. There is Paris, there is the Mediterranean, there is Africa, there is all of Central Asia. Clearly, it's mostly a map of China. At the same time, is this a map of the world? Yes, it is a map of the world the same way that the Ptolemaic maps were maps of the known world, the Ecumene. It's not of equal scale. What Ricci brought was this feature of the equal scale, and it's a big deal. Matteo Ricci was a map maker among many other things. He was a man of enormous talents. He was, together with Michele Ruggeri, we saw in that map before, the first who learned Chinese to a level that he could function in Chinese and read Chinese texts very quickly. He had a specific background in astronomy and geography that he got at the Jesuit College in Rome, where probably he saw that globe that I showed you before. One of the things that made him famous, among the many things actually that made him famous, but from the point of view of history of mapping, he's a giant because of this. He made a large map of the world. He first made other maps. We know he made 4. These are copies of derived maps that were made based on what he did. When he was in Guangdong, him and Ruggeri were the first to get out of Macau and being able to enter the empire. They went to Zhaoqing, that was the provincial capital of Guangdong. He says in his letter back to Italy that people had saw the atlas that he had, the Ortelius Atlas, this large collection of maps of the world, and they were amazed and they said, can you do a world map like you have it here, printed in Latin so that we can understand it? And he said he made 3 maps before the one that is the only one we know clearly, 1602. They are lost, we just know the titles, but they were already quite influential, so they were reproduced in other books, other encyclopedia of the Ming Dynasty. What is very different compared to the other Chinese map that you saw is that they represent a globe. They have this spheric image, and they basically have America for the first time. But at the same time, when you look at the map, as much as possible, you want to look to a map that you can date, a map that you can understand. These are maps that are said to be based on Ricci. They are after Ricci. This is the map that Ricci made. This is a map of 3 meters per 2, roughly. It's a very large map. I will move to a slide that gives you a slightly better way to see it. This is a map that he actually made 1 year later. It's printed, but the mountains are hand-colored. It remains in 1 copy in Liaoning, and there is 1 copy in Seoul. Instead, this map here has around 8 copies remaining in the world. Printed. They are both printed in Beijing, 1 year of difference. Now, ideally, I would zoom in, but there are two issues. One is not very convenient to do it while we are basically televising. The second is actually the time now. It's not much to go into the details, but the main feature of this map, which is a very, very large map made in 6 wood blocks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, very large, is that well, first of all, there are 2 copies in the Vatican, a few in Japan. There is 1 in America, none in China. They were clearly, the Japanese could read them in Chinese, but no one else in the Vatican could read this map. So mostly they were sent to Europe or to Japan. Even the copy, for example, now in America has been bought in Japan. The Japanese were very eager to study this map, and we will see that they kept copying this map. In China, the map had an influence, but not so much, and it got superseded by other maps, by other Jesuits. But at the same time, this is so seminal that really is the map that I want to spend the last few minutes talking about, because it's gigantic. Many of the place names for America, Europe, Africa, the single European countries are the same place names in Chinese that Ricci gave them, by Italy and for Italy and Hispania. Some changed a bit, some didn't. Oluopa. If we could zoom in, you would see them. They are these large names for these 4 continents and then for each country. The first thing you will notice is that compared to the European maps that he used, he changed the position of, well, the center. He still has a numbering system. It goes back to Ptolemy. That means there is a 0 meridian here that has always been used since Greek times. It's roughly the Canary Island, or they were called the Fierro Islands. That's 0. But on the other hand, a normal map produced in Europe at the time would have Europe here at the center. China is not exactly at the center. The center is basically the Pacific, but China is towards the center. It's a map in Chinese for a Chinese audience. It wouldn't make sense to have Europe at the center. And it's also a map that, even though we don't have the time, nor it would be pretty complicated to go into the text, has a lot of text. And much of the text talks about the concepts that were quite foreign to Chinese map makers, but that was very traditional for European map makers, of this projection, the Ptolemaic idea that basically you have to fuse astronomy and geography to get a good projection of the world, to have a sphere, a globe that fits a plane in 2 dimensions with a specific set of rules to create this, with a grid of meridians and parallels. And all this part talks about astronomy, projection, and what is really the reason why this way of making maps is superior. On the other hand, this map is very, very large. Ricci was not only a map maker, but very far from that. He was a very busy missionary. He was really, map making for him had some scientific interest as such, but it was a missionary tool mainly. That means that he found that he really had an edge compared to the preceding maps produced in China in creating maps that were more precise, founded on this fusion of astronomy and geography. And he wanted to show that a civilization that was able to do this was also worth taking seriously. And also, in a very elementary way, the way he describes in his letter when he was still in Guangdong, he wanted to show where they came from, okay, where the Jesuits came from. He wanted to tell them about Italy, the Pope. There is so much text here that tells you that also a very rosy idea of Europe, where during in 1602, there was not a lot of religious peace in Europe. But if you read this, you think that everything is perfect, everybody obeys the Pope, and it's a paradise. But also, this map, the thing that really now scholars that work on this map, I also work on a collaborative project on this map. And the project really talks about the Ricci maps. Now, this is really the map everybody talks about, but the influence is very large. And not only I show you other copies made in Japan, made in Korea, but also is not just Ricci. I mean, here, for example, in the middle, there is a Ming Dynasty scholar, Li Zhizao. He was a very important official. He converted to Christianity. He was collaborated with Ricci. Actually, there are spread around here 5 to 6 of the main intellectuals operating in China at the time, vouching for Ricci, saying that his map should be taken seriously, and often making the argument as specifically is here. And here you can, this is a website created by the Ricci Institute in San Francisco. It's very handy if you want to have a better understanding of the map. It gives you a summary of many of these parts. And Li Zhizao really makes the point that in the end, even in ancient China, there was this understanding that the Earth was a sphere and that this was the right way to make maps. That was not controversial, uncontroversial in Ming Dynasty China. Actually, that was not the normal way maps were made, with meridians that parallel and the Earth as a sphere. In fact, it was a minority view. But the Ming Dynasty scholars were saying, not only this is a great cartographer, mathematician, giving us new information about America, for example, and our space in the world, but also it goes back to ancient Chinese sources. It's compatible with our own tradition. That was part also of the Jesuit strategy of accommodation. Basically, it's not just new. It's something that basically has always been with you. Even the knowledge of a Christian God has always somehow been with you in China. And then the last few slides I'll show you are many, many colorful, influential, shown effects of the influence of this map. Because especially outside of China, this map was very influential. In China, again, the Jesuits remained there. They printed newer maps. The newer maps superseded the Ricci map. But sometimes, even in China, the copies that edit decorative elements remained. This, in fact, there is no printed copy of the Ricci map here, meaning in China, but in Nanjing, there is a hand-made copy, a manuscript of the Ricci map, same size, same text, it's identical, but a lot of animals. After all, the Jesuits were providing, from a traditional point of view, when we talk about Western influence, you would say they were providing scientific, new, cutting-edge information. But from Ming Dynasty point of view, they were providing exotic information. That could also be accurate, but when you mix it back with the exotic ships and the exotic animals, then it makes more sense. It's more attractive. You want to keep it. There is a copy in Nanjing. There is a copy in Taipei. It was recently shown at an exhibition at the Palace Museum in Taipei. Similar copy, and again, the structure is really the same. The long text, the astronomical details, but then again, the animals. This was made in Korea. This is a copy that, if you happen to go to Hong Kong until the 7th of June, I believe, is still on display, and a very large map exhibition, the one that Priscilla was mentioning we were mounting at the time last year. This is a copy that is owned by the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And it's a copy identical in most elements to the printed map of 1602, but hand-colored. And also because it was used in Japan with some Japanese reading katakana and hiragana for the strange names like America, and also the all exotic names for Europe that would not make much sense to the Japanese. This is another map, a copy of the Ricci map, and also makes you understand better the previous one. So this is the grid of the meridians and the parallels. You see it much more clearly in this map. But on the other hand, the map in Hong Kong is the only one held outside of Japan. There are around 30 copies of the Ricci map made in Japan. They all stay in Japan beside the one that is in Hong Kong now on display. One more thing about this map. In Japan, it really was the way, because the country was closed, the Jesuits were expelled. they didn't have access to more modern maps printed by Jesuit in China, in Ming China and Qing China, so in 1600, even 1700. They kept copying this map. They got quite a few copies in 1600, and they copied. They copied it, and they use it for teaching cosmography. Again, cosmography at the time just means this approach that combines geography and astronomy. The map, though, was a Jesuit product with this Jesuit symbol, and it had elements of religion. That was why the map was made. This is the copy in the Vatican. That's the position of the Jesuit symbol. But if you compare, this is the copy that is now the only copy in the US. It was bought in Japan. And because it was bought in Japan, and Japan had these anti-Christian laws, this symbol had to be erased. So the Ricci map, for any other purposes, the copies are identical. The copy here, the symbol is still visible here in the position where it was deleted. Manuscript copy simply didn't have it. This is a print. So this is really a print, the original 1602 print with erasure on the paper. Instead, this is a manuscript copy. So the map was used only as a scientific tool. It was not used as a missionary tool at all. The conclusion is that basically I talk about mapping China and mapping the world, focusing on two maps, the Ortelius map of China and the Ricci map of the world. At the same time, I show you many other maps of China and the world, and also this notion of, because it was a big issue for me when I was preparing my book and trying to compare Chinese maps made in Europe with Chinese maps made in China, and trying to understand if they were the same thing. I mean, is a map of China made in Europe that's China, Japan, and Southeast Asia map of China? Well, if the title is China for the purpose of my book, yes, it is. It is a map focused on China. What about a Chinese map that has Africa and Europe? Is that a map of China? It still occupies 80% of the frame, but is that a map of China or a map of the world? It's an issue that has no very simple solution, but needs to be kept in mind. The thing about these maps is that the Ortelius map, we know, comes from Chinese sources. We don't know exactly which ones, but basically someone saw them, got a copy, many were printed, they used elements, they superimposed the things that they knew, the names of the provinces, the names of the city, they didn't know how to put them. They did a messy translation, but still, the first European maps of China and the subsequent European maps of China are based on maps of China, made in China, in Chinese. So they are also product of translation. For the Ricci map, this is even more clear. Ricci had a team of scholars and helpers and helping to translate into Chinese a massive world maps, where he actually also used many other printed maps coming from the Ortelius Atlas. And although sometimes it's just one direction it's in, Ricci brings Western knowledge to China. But on the other hand, when Europe also got this information about China and East Asia from Chinese sources, it also transformed the image of the world that China had. So this image of China and the world that we have are really like the outcome of an exchange in two directions. So that's my conclusion. Many thanks. And if there are any questions, I think I can take them.
Thank you for a really stimulating and informative talk about cross-cultural cartography, I suppose. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Thank you again for the discussion. I found it particularly interesting, when you're talking about the map in which China is at the center of it, which is that consistent with China's own view of viewing themselves as the center of the world?
Yeah, you could say, well, this is maybe the most readable version of it, even though this is the map of the world. It is among all the Chinese maps that I show you, is the only map that includes so much of the rest of the world. Sure, I mean, it is consistent with the fact that the focus is on China. But on the other hand, if you think about the Western maps, that's why I wanted to have this longer introduction. In these Western maps, yeah, it's a slice of the world, okay? Before the age of exploration, before the age of a complete mapping of the whole world in mathematical terms with Magellan. European maps can either be like this, where Jerusalem is at the center, and then the world is organized under religious principle, or they can be like this. They look mathematical, but it's only the part of the world known to the West. So it's very natural that the map of the world produced in China had China, well, with much more information. What starts becoming more challenging is that even after Ricci brought this model didn't become the universally accepted model, and most maps of China, most maps of the world created in China still kept China as 80%, 90% of the world. I would say that being centered, I mean, a self-centered cartography is the natural form of cartography for any civilization, not only for Chinese civilization. If I understand your question correctly.
Yes, more or less. I'm never usually particularly clear, but I guess I was thinking from a philosophical view of the world that the Chinese viewed themselves as the center of the universe, and everyone else, was secondary to that. In terms, if you look at their dealings with the Portuguese, or just the entire system of how they viewed the tributary system and things like that, in terms of how they dealt with trade with Japan, trade with other countries, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I don't want to belabor it, I apologize. It just feels like it has to do with their overall world view of themselves as the center of everything.
You could argue many Europeans still have this image of the world.
I think you'll find much the same kind of bias if you look, for example, at the press in any particular place. When I first came to Hong Kong, I was very struck by how if there was a Hong Kong angle on something, like the Hong Kong-born wife of a well-known academic whose name I will not mention, but he was a well-known academic anthropologist studying Hong Kong. She had a fight in a car park in London with his Chinese girlfriend, and this was reported in the Hong Kong press because there was a Hong Kong angle to it. So if it was remotely related to Hong Kong, it was a lot more likely to make it into the SCMP.
The one I showed before with the, let me see if this is what you mean. This one? Mm-hmm.
So this is very early. So do you know where are the sources? Because this is before Zheng He?
Yeah. This is before Zheng He. So this map is, again, by convenience I'm using this map. In fact, this map is the Korean version of the previous map. Korea is larger. This is the original map I wanted to show, but let's go back to this because the structure of two maps is the same. So this map has been created at the very beginning of the Ming Dynasty, and clearly it goes back to the Mongolian Empire. Even when sources are discussed, in the Korean text, it says that it goes back to Mongolia, basically Yuan dynasty sources of the Mongolian Empire, which basically means there are Chinese information about this part, clearly about China. In this specific map, there are also Korean information about Korea. This comes from Arabic sources, Islamic map making. A lot has been made. These are the sources of the Nile. What exactly this lake is doing here is not particularly clear. This map seems to show that Africa has a southern tip, and we know which shape it has, but that's very doubtful that it's substantial, because certainly Zheng He didn't go there yet.
Yeah, but you went to Mozambique, like
And yeah, I mean, mountains of the moon, this is basically the sources of the Nile. But there is basically no doubt that we know that there was a very large amount of Islamic astronomers and geographers, especially from Iran. There were the two provinces of the Mongolian Empire, Yuan dynasty and Ilkhan Iran, that were collaborating very, very strictly. And they brought maps. There is no doubt about that. So almost everything that goes beyond China goes back to Islamic sources. The incorporation in a Chinese map of Islamic sources.
So Zheng He knew where he was going.
Well, Zheng He knew where he was going in the sense that he was also Muslim. He was basically connected with Muslim traders in the Indian Ocean, and the Indian Ocean was very well known to Chinese traders. Basically, so the Indian Ocean would be here on this map. He knew where. Now, it really seems that in past times, very few people would, especially on ships, would use maps to go around. Most likely, he had list of harbors that would be useful for him. The next one on his route that would guide him in his expedition. Yeah, but this is a map that has been studied, especially in his Korean, in this Korean copy, but the Chinese copy is identical, as the most complete, comprehensive map of the known world anywhere in the world by 1400. I mean, European maps clearly were much better for Europe, but they had much lesser breadth of information. So combining Chinese sources with Islamic sources, basically, that is something that was done only in China in this period. Now again, Zheng He is, he kind of explains why Zheng He went there, or gives a framework to understand it, but precedes him. And it also shows that basically a lot of maps are made by combining knowledge from different people, from translating from different traditions and putting them all together. If you look for scholarship on this map, mostly you will find something on this one that's called Kangnido map. That's the Korean name of the map. Less on this one, which is Damin Hongyitu, so the Great Ming Composite map. Simply because basically, actually, this map is lost. 1402, we don't have it. But we have, let me go back here. We have 3 copies of this map, of which this is the earliest. They're all in Japan. And they are all so similar, and plus there is a large textual material that tells you who made the map, when it was made in 1402, and so on. That we identify the 3 copies as being basically almost identical, and we are confident enough that we go back to a 1402 map. The paradox here is that this map has not been lost. This map has been created, we all believe, by 1390 something. But there is no text. The tags, it's an enormous map, as you see here. The white things are tags in Manchu, because this map was a map created by the Ming Dynasty, but when the Manchu emperors after 1644 went to Beijing, they kept using this map. There was so much rich information that for them, to make it readable for them, each place name has been tagged. So if you don't know Manchu, you cannot go back to the Chinese names. And plus, the map is not so easily available. The other one has all the Chinese names. And it's also available in more copies. And so that if you look at it, you will see 1402 Korean world map. That's considered basically the best world map in circulation. In fact, the source is this. It shows an openness of Chinese cartography to the world, but it's not that openness that makes the world a place without a specific center. The center is super clear. The part occupied by China is overwhelming. But the information is more than in any other world map at the time, even in Europe.
You showed a globe.
Yeah. Yeah, this one, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Did the Chinese use globes, or Ritchie introduced?
Yeah,
Globes
the
to
Jesuit
China.
introduced globes.
And then there is a history of the evolution of globes that you can mention a little bit about it. And what is the ping pong game in between globes and maps that you can mention also about that?
Well, I'm not really an expert on globes as such. I show one globe which is extremely famous. This one, the Beheim globe. This is more or less the time when globes started being made regularly in Europe. At the beginning, globes were like this, and the one I show you in 1570, they were hand-painted. And the relationship between maps and globes, well, basically, you can convert by the same rules of projection a globe into a map like this. This is a visual representation of half the globe as this. With the age of exploration, the format of showing the world in two globes, which is often the new world, the old world, gets more common, but this is an ambiguous wording for globes, because this is just a two-dimensional representation. Matteo Ricci did not have a globe, or at least a globe made by him doesn't remain, but soon after him, well, first of all, you see, even in any, because of this idea of cosmography, so this merging of astronomy and geography, anytime a cartographer is showing a map, here they show this very important Jesuit cartographer showing a map, here you have a celestial globe. Okay, the globes were actually not generally understood as what we now normally have, just a globe that represents the Earth standing alone. In fact, most of the time there was a pair of globes. One was a celestial globe and one a terrestrial globe. This is a celestial globe. It also has the animal of the zodiac. So they would use a celestial globe for the astronomical observation and use basically like simple tools actually to make measures. And they would do the same also with terrestrial globes. Based on the Ricci map, which basically we can see it. We can see that this made an impression. These are actually 1602 means someone roughly 10 years after Ricci made this map already used it for a popular encyclopedia. So it made an impression, the fact that you could represent the world as a globe, which was not in any sense the normal way you would do it in Chinese cartography. In Chinese cartography has this ambiguous tradition that while astronomically the Earth was treated as a sphere in the heaven, from the point of view of drawing maps, the Earth was considered as a flat. So whenever they have this Western influence map, they are very explicit in having the global sphere. And all of this put a lot of emphasis on the globe. But basically, around 20 years after this map in 1602, two Jesuits made a globe in Chinese. They tried to give it to the emperor. It's a very famous globe by Longobardi. It's at the British Library now. And it was Jesuit that kept making globes for the emperor, basically, or for the high elites. There was not a Chinese native tradition of making globes as a way to represent the Earth on three-dimensionally. On the other hand, already by 1550, 1560s, Mercator, the other, we mentioned Ortelius is a great cartographer, the author of the first atlas, but actually his atlas was not named Atlas. His atlas was named Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, so the theater of the globe. So basically, the visual display of the information about the world. The name Atlas goes to Mercator, who was an even more important cartographer, and he was a big globe maker. He would print globes by creating gores. So he would have just a slice, generally 12 slices, and then they were mass produced. And then you would print them, and then you still would have to glue them on a surface. The Jesuits in China didn't have access to that kind of mass produce, and didn't have the need to create so many globes, so they would always do them hand painted. The bottom line is that globes remain like an exotic item in China. Didn't really, the three-dimensional ones created by Jesuits, to my knowledge, it took the age of modernization, late 1800, early 1900, to have mass-produced printed globes in China as in the West. But they say that actually Muslim cartographers created globes, and even in China. So the Muslim cartographers, Islamic cartographers, had this tradition also making globes. It goes back to the same tradition, the Ptolemaic tradition. It was the same tradition. It seemed they created globes, but we don't have them. We don't have them, they're gone.
Your presentation, one passage came to my mind. This passage was once said by Japan Premier Minister during the Sino-Japanese War. He once said that in order to conquer the world, we must first conquer China. Now, in our context, I want to make some adjustment that, like, in order to know the world, we must first know China. What do you think about this idea?
Well, basically, when you look at, I think of this idea in the terms of the map makers that were active at the time. When you look at this image that I showed you before, yeah, this one, then you see that there were atlases produced. This is just a very sketchy image of the world. Okay? But it also shows that there is a so-called old world. What does it mean? 3 parts of Asia, 3 parts of the world. But the 3 parts of the world are not equal, meaning it's all of Europe, it's all of Africa, and the eastern part of Asia is unknown. It's not known at all. That's why it's so awkward the way that America is clearly the new world, but East Asia to the Portuguese and the Jesuit was equally the new world. I mean, the West Indies and the East Indies, basically America and East Asia, were the 2 new worlds that were not mapped. And you see here that the coast of Brazil and the Caribbean are much better known than whatever is shown here that is supposed to be East Asia. And for a long time, they even merged East Asia with America in one kind of container because they didn't know it. So from the point of view of the cartographer of this time, 1520 to until Matteo Ricci, 1590, the new worlds were 2. I mean, one was basically conquered by Spanish and Portuguese, and also basically completely controlled by missionary and not Christianized. And the other part of the world that was not really known, but was very different because it was under a very established cultural tradition that was also very stable as a state, but equally unknown and open, basically, at the real target, the real precious target of missionary conquest was Japan and China. So from their point of view, in fact, America was already under control. The thing that was really neither controlled nor really known was East Asia, Japan and China. And that's why actually when you have maps like the one I show and before, by Europeans, there are these different ways to understand China. I mean, this map is just, they found a map of China, they pasted it somewhere in East Asia. They don't know how it fits really, okay? North at the top. Finally, they have some kind of list of provinces. They know where to position it, but they really don't know what to do. Then, just a few years later, Michele Ruggeri is the first Jesuit that understands Chinese. He uses Chinese maps. And he has this image of China as part of East Asia. And in fact, the title of this map basically is telling you that it's the region of China and the adjacent countries. And it's inside a report. The copy that we have in Hong Kong, University of Science and Technology, just have this map. The other only copy that we have of this identical map printed, only 2 copies, is that the Jesuit archive. It's inside a long written report by Michele Ruggeri saying, how are we going basically to convert East Asia? And this is the stage where this game is going to be played. Okay? So and this is a similar way to represent it, just more like this is vertical with Southeast Asia, this is more horizontal, more emphasis on Japan. But basically, these are 2 maps made by missionaries with the idea, we know this place, we will conquer this place. I mean, for the missionary, it was a spiritual conquest. But on the other hand, there were doubts. I mean, the Japanese were clearly doubting how the Jesuit would be disinterested in their action in Japan. That's why they banned them out of Japan. There was always an ambiguity in how much you can keep separate spiritual conquest from potentially dangerous foreign conquest. So yes, Japan is very sensitive to this because they are somehow at the margin of this large cultural sphere, and they were more exposed also to European penetration for long than China, more fragile, and at the same time also more aggressive at times. More for China, in the end, the Jesuits were never considered a threat. But Martino Martini, when he published that map of China, didn't just publish a map of China. He managed to publish a whole book, which was basically a translation of that atlas I showed you before in Chinese, with 1 map of China, 1 map of each province, long Latin description for all the country, each province. It was really like a handbook on how finally, that's why he was so proud when he got this image that I show you in the painting. He was so proud that finally he put China really where it belonged on a map. There are also other images that show him that he opens a door and basically just finally China will be known to the world thanks to him. And it's a linguistic element in many parts. I mean, until you know Chinese, you cannot do it.
Well, we're getting to 8:30, so perhaps I should call at least the formal part of this session to a halt. And thank you very much indeed for a really stimulating and interesting talk, and also for a beautifully prepared one. Your PowerPoints are quite lovely in themselves. So thank you for coming over and telling us about these 2 maps in particular and the insights that they give us into both Western and Chinese thinking at the time.
Many thanks.
Okay, I think there are a few nibbles outside.